bal peh. Everything was by heart. There was no need for him to consult any books. Any question that was asked over the radio live, he had everything encyclopedically organized in his mind to be able to answer the questions. And this later became Yehaveh Daat, which is the most accessible of the works of Chacham Ovadiah. And when I was even a teenager, we used to learn in the shiurei halacha, when we would have halacha class, there were some Sephardic boys in the class. So the rabbi would bring, Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zichrono Livracha also, and then he would bring us Yehaveh Daat, and we would compare the tshuvot of the various poskim. But at that time, my teachers told me, my Ashkenazic teachers told me, when it comes to a halachic question, you follow Chacham Ovadiah. Even they knew that somebody of his stature was really unequaled. And of course, being my age, I figured that I would see the day that there would no longer be, sadly, Chacham Ovadiah anymore. And I would one day have the responsibility, a massive responsibility really, to be able to describe, to convey the greatness of someone that really for many generations has not been seen. Someone with an encyclopedic knowledge that's almost frightening to reflect upon when we consider ourselves. We're very humbled. As everybody knows, he had a photographic memory. There are stories about interviewers whom he would challenge. He would say, open any book on the shelf, open it to any page, I'll tell you what's written. There was a movie made about Chacham Ovadiah a couple of years ago where they interviewed his family, and they told many family members that previously had been reluctant to speak to the press. And this time they opened up, they spoke, and one of the stories that they told was of this meeting with this journalist where Chacham Ovadiah said, take any book, I'll show you, He took out one of the Sfarim some random sefer from the shelf, opened it to page whatever. He began reciting it word for word from the page, without seeing it. And he could do that with anything. He was a walking library. But it wasn't just what he knew, his analytic powers, his ability to access that. It's one thing to know things by heart. It's another thing to be able to access the knowledge and bring it to bear on real questions. Such a vast amount of knowledge. We all know a lot of information, and we're faced with a situation where we forget things. There are things that we know that are relevant to a situation, and we realize afterwards, I can't believe that slipped away from my mind. But Chacham Ovadiah somehow had the ability to sit down, faced with a question, not only to have an encyclopedia in his mind, but to access the encyclopedia and to bring any tangential. It's not just a matter of that he remembered responsa, he remembered a tshuva about a certain thing. He remembered something that was mentioned derech agav, something that was mentioned in passing in a certain responsa he would remember, and be able to bring it to bear on a real question in real time. That was the level of mind that he had. And it wasn't only his mind that was organized like that. He had a rare ability to convey information. To convey the information. Particularly you see that in Yehaveh Daat, but really it's true of all of his shelot and shuvot. One thing that distinguishes Chacham Ovadiah from all of the other poskim that I've seen, and all other authors of responsa, is that most other authors, if you open up Khatam Sofer, you open up even Rav Moshe Feinstein, Zichrono Livracha, any of the great poskim, you need to know the subject already when you open the tshuva. If you don't know the subject, you're going to be lost. You have to have already learned the Talmud, learned all of the sources, and then you can read the tshuva. Chacham Ovadiah is feeding a baby. When he starts, he begins with what is the pasuk, what is the source in the Talmud, what are the earliest Rishonim, the later ones, the Achronim. Okay, and now what's the contemporary situation? You can know nothing about the subject, and you open up his sefer, and he begins from the beginning. That's the greatest. Of course, you have to know how to read Hebrew first. But if you know how to read Hebrew, and he speaks a beautiful Hebrew. And I mentioned to the guys the other day, shortly after he'd passed away, one thing that's not it's not necessarily the most important thing. It's certainly not the most important thing about Chacham Ovadiah. He had beautiful handwriting. Beautiful handwriting. Most of the time you see haskamot on Sfarim, you can't read what they say. They have to put it in typeface below if you're going to understand what's written. You read his writing, it looks like artwork. It looks like calligraphy when he wrote. So he had a clarity of mind. Everything about him was clear. He was born in 1920, before there was an Eretz Yisrael, and his parents made Aliyah in 1924, when it was still Palestine, under the British. His family, many of them were involved in Etzel, all kinds of underground operations. He wasn't. but his family was. And he went to study in Porat Yosef. His father was a very poor man. He wasn't from wealth. He was what we would call a Yodea Sefer. He knew how to learn, but he wasn't a rabbi. He wasn't a Talmid Chacham on a level that would be recognized today. But he was knowledgeable. For 3 years, he didn't have work. They struggled to survive, living in Jerusalem. And eventually he opened a makolet. He opened a little store. And the very, very famous story about Chacham Ovadiah, this story is apocryphal. It's like a legend. It was a living legend. That his father obviously couldn't afford to compensate any employees to work in the store. And he couldn't work all day long. So who did he take? Little Ovadiah to work in the store. And of course, what did then just little Ovadiah want to do? He didn't want to be working in the store. He wanted to be learning. But kibud av'em, he had no choice. He came, he worked. There are 2 versions of the story. In one version, HaRav Ezra Atiyah, who at the time was the Rosh HaYeshiva of Porat Yosef, came to Chacham Ovadiah's father and begged him, please, let Ovadiah come back to learn. This kid is an Eloi, he's a genius. He's going to be something. You can't let him go. And his father said, listen, what am I going to do? I need to make parnasah. I need to survive. And remember, back then, they didn't have the government supporting the people learning. If you didn't have money, that was it. You had nothing. So the Rosh Yeshiva said, can't you please find somebody else to do it? He said, I can't afford to pay an employee. I can barely make ends meet. So the story goes that the next day, Rav Ezra Atiyah, the Rav Ovadiah's father, came to the store a couple of hours into the day, and who does he see working behind the counter? The Rosh HaYeshiva. He says, what are you doing here? He said, your son's learning is more important than mine. I sent him to learn, I'll watch the store. This story that's one version of the story. And the other version of the story, they kept having thieves come into the store and steal stuff because he wasn't paying attention. So eventually his father fired him and sent him back to the yeshiva. Either way, it's true that he almost ended up working behind the counter in the store. And thankfully, he eventually went to Yeshivat Porat Yosef, where even at a very young age, at the age of 9, he was already writing his own chidushim. Ideas that he had, original ideas. As he himself said, I would never say this about him, he himself said, they were not dvarim shebirumo shel olam. I wasn't writing the most profound things at the age of 9, but I was writing something. And in retrospect, I'm glad I started. He said, many people made fun of me when I was a kid, that I was writing things. Who do I think I am? I'm so young, at the age of 9, at the age of 17, writing things. He said, but guess what? Those people who made fun of me, they didn't write anything, and I wrote 40 books by now. So Baruch Hashem, he went in the right path, and we all benefited from it. At the age of 17, he became controversial. There were a lot of olim, a lot of immigrants from Iran. And his teacher, HaRav Ezra Atiyah, told him, I want you to teach halakha to this group of Persian Jews. And Chacham Ovadiah, at the time he didn't have smicha yet, he was still just Ovadiah Yosef, went and he starts teaching a group of Persian Jews. These Jews who had grown up in Iran, who was the posek, who was the big posek of the Iranian Jews? All the Persians know, who was it? Ben Ish Chai. Ben Ish Chai. Everything was Ben Ish Chai, everything was according to Ben Ish Chai. Well, Chacham Ovadiah didn't like that from the beginning, and that was one of his signature departures from a tradition. He would read the Ben Ish Chai and then say, this is wrong. We don't follow this. We follow Maran Z Yosef. We follow the Shulchan Aruch. The Ben Ish Chai in many places deviates from the Shulchan Aruch. And Chacham Ovadiah would correct it. Now obviously this was really controversial. Who does this kid, 17 years old, he's telling a bunch of people older than him, who their whole life had been following the Ben Ish Chai, that they were wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong, no, you have to follow the Shulchan Aruch. Who does he think he is? They complained, other Rabbanim complained, but again, HaRav Atiyah defended him. He said, no, he's doing right, he's saying right, leave him alone. So he continued. At the age of 20, he already had smicha. Of course, what he knew at the age of 20 is probably what most rabbis know at the age of 90, but that's another story. He was already beyond what he needed to know, but he got officially smicha at age 20. At the age of 27, he became the head of the Bet Din in Cairo. It's almost unimaginable, a 27-year-old, what we know of a 27-year-old, being a head of a Bet Din of Cairo, of a large Jewish community. He had all kinds of battles to fight down there that he had to deal with. And he was there for a couple of years before he was called back to become a rabbi, first in Tel Aviv, and eventually, obviously, the chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel. This is some of his history that we all know. I'm leaving out the political component that I think is a much longer story and maybe much more complex. I do want to address just a couple of things about him on a meta level, beyond the history. We know that obviously his erudition, his encyclopedic knowledge, everybody recognized. But what did he really accomplish? And to illustrate what kind of a person he was, first of all, we think oftentimes they did in this movie that I mentioned before, they also interviewed people on the street in Tel Aviv. What do you think of Chacham Ovadiah? Oh, he's terrible, he's Haman, they have a very negative view of him. Because they think of him as, and they asked him, do you think Chacham Ovadiah Yosef, is he a strict posek? Is he mahmir? Or is he a lenient one? And what did all the chilonim say? Oh, very mahmir, he's very stringent. But within the religious world, it was the opposite. Everybody said, who is this? He's too lenient. Everything, if you look at the in Yabia Omer, which is the real magnum opus of Chacham Ovadiah, those are the tshuvot that you could take one responsa of Chacham Ovadiah and spend a day, 2 days, 3 days just studying the one tshuva. There's so many sources to look up. It's so profound, so complicated, very long tshuvot. That's where you really see his greatness. So, if you look at the list of tshuvot in Yabia Omer, and they have a summary at the end. Almost everyone says ve'ela lahatir. He concluded to be lenient. Almost every single one. The cases where he was machmir, he didn't bother to write down. As Chacham Ovadiah once said himself, he said, "Listen, to be stringent, you don't need to know anything. To be stringent, you don't need to learn. Just say no. You could say no to anything, but to be lenient, you have to know." What was his greatness? How did he manifest this? Though it wasn't that he was stringent or lenient. It was that he understood the necessity of making halachic decisions that the community could live with. That a complicated and diverse community can live with. That not only the Haredi community of the Sfaradim, who were more stringent in general, but even the more Shomrei Masoret, what we call, the more traditional, the less strict groups of Sfaradim could be connected to. Because Sephardic community, traditionally, we've all been under one tent. We don't say to somebody, oh, you're more religious, you go to the Orthodox Sephardic synagogue. You're less, you go to the conservative, you go to the Reform. We're all together. So we need a halacha that everybody can live with. And this is something that Chacham Ovadiah understood, not just for the Sfaradim, but also for the entire Jewish people. After the Yom Kippur War, very famously, over 1,000, or people estimate, between 900 and perhaps over 1,000 agunot, cases of agunah. Women who their husbands had been killed or lost in battle and couldn't remarry. Because there was no, you need some kind of proof, you need some kind of testimony, you need some kind of evidence to allow what we call eshet ish la'alma, to allow a married woman to remarry. How can you do it without any kind of evidence? The chief's Ashkenazic rabbi didn't want to do it. The rabbi of the IDF didn't want to handle it. Who was the only person willing to do it? Chacham Ovadiah. He said, I'll take it. Every single case he found a heter. Every single case. They said weeks where he didn't smile. All he did was work on these cases, hear testimony about case after case after case after case. He found a way for every single one of the people to remarry. He saved generations of people. There's a story that one particular woman that he was working on a case of Igun, that late into the night, he finally discovered the heter, and he wrote up the entire piece that he was going to present, the psak din, for the bet din the next day. But he couldn't sleep. He said, this woman is right now waiting till tomorrow to find out in the bet din what's going to happen. Tonight she can't sleep. She's so stressed, she doesn't know, am I going to say no, she can never remarry? So he said, I know it's not right. How can I call somebody the night before and tell them what the court case decision is going to be? But he couldn't, he had to call her. He picked up the phone, he took the phone number, in the middle of the night he called the woman to tell her that tomorrow everything is going to be all right. The bet din is going to give you a heter, you're going to be allowed to remarry. She was crying and he was crying. He couldn't allow her to go a night not knowing. There's another story like that later in life, where he was in the hospital. Chacham Ovadiah was in the hospital, and they had told him he needed an emergency surgery, heart surgery. Emergency surgery right away. He said, no, you have to send me home for 3 hours first. Let me go home for 3 hours, I'll come back. Aryeh Deri, who's the handler of Chacham Ovadiah, said, what are you talking about? They said, you have to go right now. He said, no, you bring me home for 3 hours, I'll come back. He said, what is the reason? He said, I was in the middle of writing a tshuva to permit a woman who was an agunah, a woman who would never be able to be remarried. He said, I don't know if I'm going to come off the operating table. What if I don't live? And that woman is going to spend the rest of her life not able to be remarried. He said, it's more important that I write the tshuva now, so that if I go, at least I know that that woman is going to be able to be free. That was the kind of sensitivity that people knew that Chacham Ovadiah had to the realities of life. Most Sfaradim, of course, relate to Chacham Ovadiah as the one who was the Mahzir Ha'atara Liyoshna, the one who wanted to return the crown to its former glory. And what do we mean by the crown to its former glory? For many generations, Sfaradim felt inferior. We know that when they came to the land of Israel, they were certainly treated with less than the utmost respect. But even the Chachamim of the Sephardic world were not treated with the greatest respect. Most Ashkenazim weren't even aware of many of the Achronim of the Sephardic world, many of the later rabbis. Anybody after the Shulchan Aruch, anyone after HaRav Yosef Karo in the 16th century, they never heard of him. So when Rav Ovadiah started writing his tshuvot, the Ashkenazic rabbis were hearing these permissive rulings for agunot and saying, who are these rabbis he's quoting? We've never even heard of them before. He exposed them to a whole new world, but what he also did was he raised the pride of Sfaradim. Because he told them, you know what? Not only are you equal to the Ashkenazim, forgive me for saying this, he told them you're better than the Ashkenazim. Those Ashkenazim, they allow all kinds of leniency, they allow you to wear a wig, we don't allow you. He gave them lots of feeling of pride. We're the more religious. We're truer to the tradition than the Ashkenazim. Don't listen to them. And so he not only told them they were equal, he said, you're even better. And that was what they needed to hear. Because many Sfaradim who felt that the only way to be accepted, the only way to be good is to go with the Ashkenazim, they finally felt a sense of self-esteem and pride. We can have our own traditions. Our traditions are even better. They're at least as good, if not better. And to see someone like Chacham Ovadiah, who was revered by everybody, by both Ashkenazic and Sephardic rabbis, they looked up to him, they revered him, they recognized him as a Gedol Hador, that gave the Sfaradim a pride that they hadn't had for hundreds of years. People talk about the Rambam, but they took the Rambam from us. Even HaRav Yosef Karo, they wrote so many commentaries on the Shulchan Aruch, the Ashkenazim did, that he's drowned in the commentaries of the Ashkenazim. But Chacham Ovadiah stood up and said, no, we are the original, I'm going to restore the original tradition, I'm going to restore the greatness of Sephardic pride and Sephardic culture, and this really made it cool to be Sephardic, basically. Before it was like, oh, we're Sephardim, we're kind of not as good, we have to hang on with the Ashkenazim. No, now it's actually everybody says, hey, I want to be Sephardic too, I want to find out that I have a Sephardic ancestor, so I can say I'm also Sephardic. It became the in thing. And he had a lot to do with that, with returning Sfaradim to their way of learning, studying what's called Alibad Dehilcheta, studying Torah, studying Talmud, not just as an academic exercise, but understanding what is the halakha, what is the bottom line. You need to walk out of the shiur knowing what the answer is to the question, knowing how to live your life. This is one of the things he emphasized greatly. I want to conclude with a story that I actually heard in a presentation here several years ago, about Chacham Ovadiah, that again speaks not just to his halachic knowledge, which we can go on and on speaking about, and there's so many volumes. I tried to figure out if I wanted to make a siyum on one of Chacham Ovadiah's books, how long would it take? Even to do one volume of Yabia Omer would take a couple of years, for sure, to get through all of it. We can go on with that forever, but there's a beautiful story that just illustrates the sensitivity and the humanity of Chacham Ovadiah, and I wanted to conclude with that because I think that speaks to, it's not just the knowledge that he had, it's what he did with it to try to heal and to try to uplift and to try to encourage and strengthen people who needed it the most. That was the true greatness of Chacham Ovadiah. So I want to conclude with a beautiful story that I heard a few years ago when we had a lecture on the topic of Chacham Ovadiah here at the synagogue on a Friday night dinner. And the story goes like this. There was a very religious Sephardic family, where the husband and wife, particularly the husband, was an ardent follower of Chacham Ovadiah, a huge fan. He was involved in Shas. I don't mean Shas the Talmud, I mean the political party Shas. He was involved in reading his Sfarim, following his halakha. He really revered Chacham Ovadiah. And he had a daughter who, what we say, went off the derech. She wasn't so religious. She left religious observance. She became secular. She was estranged from her family. And in the course of being estranged from her family, she ended up meeting a guy, having a boyfriend. They lived together out of wedlock. She gets pregnant. Fast forward 9 months, obviously, she has a baby. She has a baby in the hospital. The doctor in the room happened to be a religious Jew wearing a kippah. He notices this girl doesn't have anybody with her. I don't know, maybe she broke up with the boyfriend. I don't know where he was. She didn't have parents, nobody. So he went to her and he said, "Excuse me, what's going on? How come your parents are not here? You're all alone. You had a baby." She said, "Well, my father is very, very religious. He's a follower of HaRav Ovadiah. And, I became secular. I became estranged. I'm too ashamed. What am I going to do? To go to my father and tell him I had a baby? I'm not married. I'm not religious anymore. He thinks I'm nothing." So this doctor said, "Wow, that's really a predicament." And you know what he did? He went and he contacted Rav Ovadiah. I don't know how he did that. Maybe he had connections. He contacted Rav Ovadiah, and he told him the story. He said, "Listen, there's this girl. She's not religious anymore. She's estranged from her family. She just had a baby. She's here in the hospital with nobody and nothing. And I'm sure her parents would want to know that they're grandparents." So, it was right before Rosh Hashanah. The father of this woman who had the baby gets a phone call. The phone call is from one of the associates of Rav Ovadiah. Says, "Shana Tova, you are invited to Rav Ovadiah's office. He would like to wish you a Happy New Year." The guy says, "What? He wants to wish me Shana Tova? Who am I?" He says, "Yes, Chacham Ovadiah would like to personally wish you a Happy New Year, Shana Tova. He would like you to have cake with him and have a l'chaim with him. Please come at such and such time." The guy's like, wow, that would be like any celebrity. Think of the biggest celebrity or the greatest person, the most important person, the president of the United States calls you, says, "I want you to come." Any important personality, he's thinking, who am I to be invited to see Chacham Ovadiah? He has no idea. So, of course, he answers the invitation, gets dressed in his best suit, he gets himself ready. He shows up at the office of Chacham Ovadiah. When he's received, Chacham Ovadiah says, "Mazal Tov! Come drink a l'chaim with me. You're a grandfather. Your daughter had a baby. Now you have to call her right now and tell her Mazal Tov, and you have to go see her." And what do you think the man did? Of course, the Gedol Hador, my revered master, tells me that I need to go call my daughter. I need to make amends with her. He did it. So you see the greatness. It didn't matter that the girl wasn't religious anymore. It didn't matter that the girl had a baby out of wedlock. He wanted to make shalom between the family. And that was the kind of person he was, no matter what when he saw a circumstance of someone suffering, of a family suffering, of an individual suffering, of a society suffering, of a community suffering, he used his knowledge and he used his influence to accomplish great things, to make peace, to make harmony, to heal the wounds of those who were suffering, and to improve the lives of those who needed it the most. And for that, even more than for his knowledge, so many are eternally grateful to him. Yehi Zichro Baruch, Tenafshot Tzara V'Tzara Chaim. I'd like to invite now Rabbi Shem Tov to say a few words.